But this isn't just about the Baltic states and Poland. This is also about countries like Georgia, like Moldova, former Soviet countries which Putin very much has his eye on, which want to live in a more Western way, which want to embrace democracy and freedom, and which, if NATO isn't prepared to stand up for Ukraine, what hope do any of those other countries have to share our values?
I'm Dr. Walter Dorn. I teach military officers at the Canadian Forces College and the Royal Military College of Canada. And I am going to be debating in favor of the motion that Ukraine should negotiate peace.
My name's Freya Jones. I am a journalist with OSINT For Ukraine, and I also study modern languages at the University of Oxford. I will be arguing that Ukraine should not negotiate with Russia.
Ukraine should negotiate for peace. Why? To stop the killing sooner, bring Ukraine into the EU and NATO faster, rebuild Ukraine better. I think we have to recognize that sooner or later this war will end with negotiations. Those two countries have to be neighbors for decades and centuries to come. So sooner is better. Why we won't want in a few years to say, why couldn't we have had a better deal before hundreds of thousands died or were injured? Why were we delaying for so long? And I think we also need to recognize that NATO will not accept Ukraine as a member while Ukraine is at war. Doing so would mean that NATO members go to war with a nuclear-armed Russia. Responsible leaders in the Cold War avoided this, and the sooner we get some sort of peace agreement that is in Ukraine's interest, the less chance of dangerous escalation. Now, I don't think that Ukraine needs to give up territory to Russia, but it may need to recognize in a treaty the fact that Russia has control over some of Ukrainian territory. And I also believe that Ukraine has already given Putin's Russia a bloody nose, and that Russia has learned a strong lesson about doing its aggression. So for these reasons, I think the sooner that Ukraine and Russia come to a deal, the better will be in the interests of the Ukrainian people and the world.
So before I make my own case as to why Ukraine should not negotiate with Russia, please could you explain how Ukraine, recognizing that some of its territory is occupied by Russia, is any different from it essentially giving up that territory?
Ukraine doesn't need to give Russia territory, nor should it ever do so. But it might need to recognize the fact in a treaty, just as it does in the Minsk II agreement, that there is control of its territory by a non-governmental entity, that is, by a non-Ukrainian government. And that was the basis for the Minsk II agreement. And I could see a similar sort of arrangement with Russia. However, Ukraine will continue to say that it owns the territory and Russia is there illegally, even if it has to recognize the de facto presence in eastern Ukraine.
But if Russia is there, then essentially it's in control. And if it's there, then that is also, I believe, unnecessary. It is unnecessary if NATO comes out with the correct support for Ukraine to prevent negotiations with a terrorist state from needing to happen in a way that would be counterproductive, in my opinion. I think there are several reasons why Ukraine should not negotiate with Russia. But when I say that, I'm referring primarily to the current situation as things are right now. I do not believe that Ukraine should negotiate with Russia now, but also more broadly speaking, Russia is a terrorist state. It has committed numerous atrocities, launched an illegal invasion of Ukraine, full scale in 2022, illegally annexed Crimea before that in 2014. To negotiate with the Kremlin lends legitimacy to Putin's regime through what is essentially appeasement. Secondly, Russia does not have anything like a good record of actually keeping to agreements that it makes, and Putin's position is clear. He does not believe Ukraine should exist. He does not respect its autonomy as a sovereign nation. There is no guarantee at all that a negotiation would last, would be successful, would be respected by Russia, which has form on going back on its word.
Russia has committed atrocities in Ukraine, and I'm very glad that Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for some of those atrocities. It's really important that we help hold Russia accountable, and the world continue to have some forms of sanctions even after a peace agreement has been signed, because that will help bind Russia and cause Russia to realize that's a mistake. And also, we need to have further sanctions that can be implemented if a peace agreement is violated, which is possible that Russia would do. But we can certainly say that the period of Minsk II since 2014, 2015 was better than the period we have now, with thousands dying on the battlefield every week instead of a dozen or so. The situation during a time of peace, even if it's an unstable peace, even if it's a peace where there are minor violations, that's still better than having an outright war that we have now. And a negotiated settlement is not appeasement. A negotiated settlement is driving a tough bargain that really puts a big onus on Russia to withdraw from vast territories that it currently occupies. And Russia will have to make all kinds of commitments and be held accountable for it. And in the meantime, Ukraine can rebuild. It can create strong defenses so that if Russia starts again, it won't be unprepared like Ukraine was in February 24th, 2022.
I mean, I don't actually believe that Ukraine being ceding territory, having some taken by Russia, occupied by Russia, recognizing that it's occupied by Russia, and then rebuilding in the rest of the country. I just don't think that that's going to work. Ukraine already has had in the past some divisions culturally between the West and the East. The East has a larger Russian first language speaking population and is more susceptible to the kind of propaganda narratives that Russia comes out with. I think that if Ukraine were to be split by a peace agreement or temporary stay, then the actual reintegration and reclaiming process, were Ukraine to ever be in a position to get that land back, which I think is unlikely, I think that it would have divided the country rather than making it stronger. You're essentially reducing Ukraine to half of what it should be.
I agree that the East and West in Ukraine have some divisions, but allowing it to remain under wartime conditions is terrible for the people in Eastern Ukraine, and that the best way for them to eventually be reunited with the whole of Ukraine is through a process of peace. The war fighting conditions are just not conducive to either side understanding, and it may take a while. If you look at East and West, it also had East and West Germany. It also had major divisions, and over time they could be united, because in that case the Soviet Union realized that its hold on Eastern Europe was tenuous and also very undemocratic. So we may need to wait till Putin is gone and some other regime is there, or you might see that one or both sides start a war again, and then there's some conquest or retaking of stolen territory. But in any case, better to wait in peace than to continue fighting and losing senseless lives while you're waiting. Because I think you agree that Ukraine can't unify the entire country with the current capability that it has.
I have several points to make in response to that. Firstly, we should look at Ukrainian public opinion. Overwhelmingly, and recent polls based in Kyiv have shown that a significant number, about 2/3 of Ukrainians, still supports continuing with the war. Yes, the conditions are terrible. What Russia is subjecting the country to is absolutely terrible, but it stands to get worse, with worse prospects in the future, if an unsatisfactory agreement is reached. What we should be focusing on is getting Ukraine into a position. NATO should not be saying what Ukraine needs, but it should be giving Ukraine what Ukraine says it needs, allowing it to strike deep within Russia with long-range capabilities, allowing it to leverage the surprise success of the Kursk offensive to actually not to come to the negotiating table on, well, to not need to come to the negotiating table, but to force Russia to concede that Ukraine is a sovereign nation that's not going to be taken. I would also, coming back to your earlier point, dispute that East and West Germany have been successfully united. The east of Germany is still considerably pro-Russian compared to the West, a lot poorer. And if you look at the recent voting, so much more susceptible to the populist, Russian-influenced or Russian-funded narratives, propaganda-wise, than West Germany. So
definitely, East Germany is now far better off now than it was during the communist regime. On each of your points, the public opinion, supports war, and still I support Ukraine fighting the war. I just want Ukraine to be in a good position on the battlefield so it can be in a good position on the negotiating table, and it needs to know what's on the negotiating table before it can do that. I think the Kursk initiative was marvelous, and it can be used as a bargaining chip at the negotiating table.
Could we not, though, say that the battlefield and the negotiating table, there is a point at which those become synonymous, or the lines between them blur? It's not like negotiations and the efforts on the battlefield are separate. What NATO needs to do is to demonstrate that it is willing to give Ukraine that push it needs to be able to leverage its success, and not to show weakness, because essentially this is an opportunity for NATO to show that it is willing to support a country which aspires to join it, which aspires to democratic Western values. And if we allow Ukraine to go to the negotiating table without having given it the support it needs to make that argument convincingly on the battlefield, then I think we do ourselves and the Ukrainians a huge disservice.
NATO definitely needs to provide Ukraine with the weapons, the intelligence, the capabilities that are needed to win on the battlefield. But let's not be naive. There are not going to be Ukrainian tanks in Moscow, and there are not going to be Ukrainian tanks going right to the Ukrainian border, not in the next few years. So better to have a negotiating table where you can find out positions, where you can push the Russians, where you can use diplomatic pressure to create some sort of peace settlement that's in Ukraine's favor. Right now, we don't have a negotiating table. I agree that the negotiating table and the battlefield are linked, but right now we don't have a negotiating table to actually even try things out. And talking is not weakness. Talking is strength. Being able to tell the Russians what they're doing is wrong, and be able to tell them to their face that that what would be a just settlement, that's a position of strength.
Do you think that Russia would accept that what it's doing is wrong? I mean, that goes against all of its propaganda narratives, and in fact, probably the Kremlin's deep held beliefs. I think if you have two sides which are just so incredibly opposed to one another, Ukraine cannot give up, will not give up, because that to do so is the end for it. Because realistically, who is going to support it to get its territories back after the point of an active conflict? And also, Russia is not going to change its mind for as long as Putin is in charge and propped up economically by his corrupt oligarch supporters. He is never going to give up on his ambition of retaking Ukraine. So I think.
Well, it is a vain ambition, and Putin is a ruthless dictator. He is not going to be able to retake Ukraine. Ukraine has shown that it's impossible for him. So he'll have to come up with some sort of compromise, and the Russians will be embarrassed by the compromise because it's not the denazification and disarmament of Ukraine that they call for in starting the war. So it will actually show the weakness of Russia when the negotiations are starting. It will show the weakness of its negotiating position, and eventual peace settlement will show how Russia really has to scale back because Ukraine is so strong on the battlefield.
But what I really fear in this is that allowing Ukraine to go forth or in fact putting Ukraine in a position where it potentially had no choice but to negotiate an unfavorable agreement with Russia, that would also show great weakness on the part of NATO. We have the capabilities to support Ukraine far more, to send more air defense systems, to send more long-range missiles with the capacity to use them, to send the defenses that we have sitting dormant to a country that really needs them. And by not doing that, we are allowing Russia to test just how much it can get away with, just how much NATO is willing to sit and stand by and watch going on. And I think that will ultimately leave us far more vulnerable, because if NATO is not something that stands up against the threat from Russia, then really what does it stand for?
I don't believe that in the domino theory that if Putin takes Ukraine, they would then go on to attack Poland or the Baltic states. It's really Russia's learned a painful lesson from this escapade. And Putin's realized that it's just really bad for his own regime as well, and so he's much less popular, even though the Russian people can't express it freely.
But this isn't just about the Baltic states and Poland. This is also about countries like Georgia, like Moldova, former Soviet countries, which Putin very much has his eye on, which wants to adopt values which want to live in a more Western way, which want to embrace democracy and freedom, and which, if NATO isn't prepared to stand up for Ukraine, what hope do any of those other countries have to share our values?
NATO is standing up for Ukraine, and it's successively added more weapons to the system. Collectively, something around $200 billion of Western funds have been in here. So I think we have a good example of showing Russia that it can't just march into a country. And so we do need to support Ukraine. We need to support Ukraine on the battlefield so that it can be better at the negotiating table.
So I have very few seconds left, but I just want to say Russia has marched into a country. NATO has not been a deterrent to it, but it can be and it should be. We can give Ukraine the weapons that it needs to mean it does not have to negotiate with a terrorist state now.
Right. Thank you, Freya. I mean, I really value this kind of discussion because we have to look at the pros and cons of negotiating. I think we also need to take into account the historical experience of the Minsk II agreements after the original Russian proxy invasion in 2014. And what we learned from that is that negotiations are possible, that peace agreements are possible, And back then, Ukraine was so weak, it really was forced into a very unreasonable treaty. But now Ukraine could be in a much better position to have a better treaty. And if we look at the history of the world, we see that former enemies can form peace treaties. We thought the Bosnia War, which lasted some 5 years, would never end, but in the end, the Dayton Peace Accords did bring peace to Bosnia. We found that Egypt and Israel could come to a peace agreement, that there could be some peace agreements, even if people still consider each other enemies. And that's in the better interest of the people on both sides, especially the long-suffering Ukrainian people. So this is really an effort to try and get another front, which is the negotiating front, so that Russia can be hammered for all its misdeeds, can be fingered, and that way we can win overall.